Hi, welcome to Exploring Hobbies. My name's Randy Nunez, and the hobby we're going to talk about today is home brewing. And to talk about home brewing, we have Art Zazadny. Welcome to the show, Art.
Hi, Randy. How are you?
So tell us what home brewing really is.
Okay, what brewing really is no different than cooking. It's very similar to a lot of cooking processes. A lot of people get into home brewing in the first place because they like to cook. So what you're really doing is you're taking some sugars from grains and then you're concentrating that. You're adding a flour called hops to it. You boil that together for some very specific reasons. When you're done boiling it, which is the brewing process, you cool it. You throw the yeast in, which is called pitching yeast. The yeast eat the sugars that are in the liquid, and they produce carbon dioxide, which is the gas, obviously, and they produce alcohol. And they change the flavor of the liquid. So it goes from almost being like a sweet tea to being the beer that we're familiar with. So that's how I got into it.
Is home brewing just beer?
It's primarily beer, but you'll find other people who make things like fermented honey, which is called mead. People will make hard ciders. They'll make just about anything you can imagine. A new thing that people are making now is pop. They'll make their own root beer, boil the roots down of sassafras or sarsaparilla, and make it from scratch, or use a concentrate to make it. But you'll see people making all kinds of things.
So it's not just for alcohol?
Right, exactly.
Oh, interesting. So how did you get started in this?
The way I got started was that my mother bought me a kit for Christmas called
Your mother got you started with brewing?
Yeah, she thought I needed a hobby, and she got me the Mr. Beer kit, which I'll show you the fermenter that came with that. And what's really nice about it is it was a kit that had everything you needed. It was made for beginners. It couldn't be any more simple. The only problem with it was it was made to brew 6 gallons. And for most people starting out, 6 gallons is an awful lot of beer. And most of the time people bottle the beer. Bottling the beer, you'll have to clean out and sanitize approximately 60 bottles. Capping them is the easy part. Cleaning them, sanitizing them, getting them back from your friends and family is the hard part. So today I'll talk a little bit about kegging, because that's what I do instead of putting it in bottles. But that's how I got started. My mother got me started.
I hope you were above a certain age when that happened.
Oh yeah. Let's see. This was about 20 years ago, so I've been brewing for about 20 years. And when you have kids, of course, in the house, you tend to kind of put your hobbies on a shelf for a while. So I did, and now that our children are 21 and 18, they're not children anymore. They're young adults, so now my wife and I can enjoy some of the hobbies that we had when we were younger, so it's kind of fun.
Okay. So why do people do home brewing?
That's a good question. The biggest question that I'll get asked by people considering home brewing is they'll say, how cheap is it? How much does it cost to brew a couple cases of beer? And I'll give you an example. Sam Adams Cherry Wheat. My father loves that beer. My neighbors love that beer. Most people who don't really know much about beer love Samuel Adams Cherry Wheat beer. And it's expensive. I think it's about $3 a bottle.
Wow.
If you brew that yourself, the cost is about 75 cents a bottle. And honey, you have to put a little honey in it. Honey's not cheap. Cherries are not cheap. So that is one of the more expensive beers to brew, is cherry wheat. Normal beers you can brew for probably less than 50 cents a bottle. Wow. So the cost savings, though, isn't the main reason that people brew. The main reason people brew is the same reason people cook their own food at home or bake their own bread, because they like the process. It's fun, and it tastes better, and they can control all the ingredients, especially now today with people with gluten-free diets. You can make gluten-free beer. You can make alcohol-free beer. I've done it a couple times. It requires a lot more work, but it can be done. You can control the amount of alcohol in the beer. It's very simple to do that. So there are a lot of other reasons to brew besides just doing it because it's less money. Even if you calculate in all the equipment you have to buy to get started, it's significantly less money to brew your own beer than to buy beer. But most people who brew their own beer don't drink much more than anybody else. They're just picky about what they drink. At least that's been my experience.
So is this legal?
Absolutely.
What's the legal ramifications of this?
The Michigan law is almost the same as every other state law. You are allowed to brew for your own personal use. So there again, the caveat is you can't sell it. You're allowed to brew 100 gallons of beer per adult per household per year. So my wife and I and our son, we're all over the age of 21, some of us significantly so, we can brew 300 gallons of beer a year. I don't know anybody that brews 300 gallons of beer a year at their house. Now, you get into trouble if you try to sell it. That's the issue. So for your own personal use, 300 gallons a year for us, 100 gallons is a lot. So one adult in a household, that's plenty of beer.
So do you ever brew beer for other people and give it to them?
That's what I do primarily for family and friends. I just brewed a beer for a friend of mine, actually our neighbors who are very good friends of ours. It was her 60th birthday, and she said, Art, I really want some cherry wheat beer. I love the beer that you brewed before. Would you brew that for me? So I did. Labor Day I brewed it, and 3 weeks later was her party and served the beer. And it's a nice feeling. It's just like cooking a meal for somebody, having them appreciate what you made. I don't cook, but this is my version of that.
So there are different factions of brewers. There's a lot, in a lot of hobbies, there seem to be different areas that people go into, and are there different factions within the brewing hobby as well?
Absolutely. I always tell people brewing is the ultimate engineer's hobby, ultimate tweaking. So there's a lot of people involved in brewing because they want to tweak and improve the process and do different things. So you have kind of the engineering group doing it. Then you have the competitive people who brew beer and enter competitions, and this is a big deal. They want to brew a specific style of beer. There's competitions among people brewing that exact kind of beer. They have certifications in beer judging. It's just like the wine snobs, we would call them, where they get together and compete. It's the same kind of thing. I actually know 2 or 3 people that I brewed beer with 15, 20 years ago who are now professional brewers. So they got into it, they're passionate about it. You also have a couple other groups. So the beer that we brew, typically as home brewers, you can do 2 things with it. You can put it in bottles, you put a small amount of sugar in with it, and you put a little yeast, or there's some yeast left in the batch. When you put it in the bottles, the yeast eats the sugar, produces a small amount of carbonation. So when you open that bottle, it has some fizz to it, right? There's people like me who say, no, that's too much trouble. I want to put CO2, carbon dioxide, right into the batch, and I can control how much CO2 I have, how much fizz, and I do it like that. There's another group of people who believe the only beer that's legitimate, real beer, is served in a cask, and it's served at cellar temperature, which means warm. You and I would call it warm, the cellar temperature. And they do not believe in artificially carbonating the beer. So they believe beer must be served cellar temperature with no artificial carbonation added. So that's what we typically refer to as the flat, warm beer that our parents or grandparents talked about when they had in England. And it's not real popular. It's popular amongst a certain group of people. But there are many, many factions within the brewing group. The one thing I wanted to bring up, and this kind of goes back into the essence of brewing, how you start, what do you do, what's the process, and it explains 2 big factions in brewing. The one is the brewing process starts like this. The grain is grown. The grain can be barley, wheat, rice, rye. It could be any of those particular grains. And what happens is they take the grain, they harvest it, they bring it into a big warehouse, and they get it wet. They soak it in water. They soak it in water until the plant starts sprouting. And then what they do is they heat it up. And when they heat it, it stops the process, the growing process, so the plant dies. But what it did was it converted the starches that are in the grain to sugar. So that process was using enzymes that are in that plant, and it naturally would have been there to help the plant grow. So you've made now a grain that would have had a starchy flavor. If you were to taste it, it tastes sweet now, because you've brought the sugars out of it. Have you ever had grape nut cereal?
Yes, years ago.
Yeah, that's it. That's malted barley. So they call that process of letting the grain turn starches to sugars, that's called malting. So malted barley, malted oats, rye, wheat, all of those types of grains, and I can show you in a kit right here. If you go to a brew store and you say, I'd like to brew a beer, and they ask you, what kind of beer do you want to brew? And you tell them a pumpkin ale. It's Thanksgiving, I'd like to have a pumpkin ale. They have a kit already made up. So this might cost $25 for 5 gallons.
So this is literally pumpkin hops, or
Well,
what would you call it?
you put pumpkin pie spices in with this.
Okay.
This is another example of you can add different things to beer. You could put jalapenos, you can put
You could
cinnamon.
have spicy beer.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is a pumpkin ale, and you'll notice that there's grain here, and the grain is cracked open, and there's different colors of grain. So this brings up another thing that they do with the grain. They heat it, and when they heat it up, it's no different than roasting coffee beans. The darker the bean, the darker the flavor, the more rich the flavor. So some of the grains get toasted, and they get a different flavor to them, kind of a chocolatey flavor. If you've ever had a stout, or a Guinness is a good example of a stout beer, the color comes from the grain being roasted, so that gives it the flavor. It has nothing to do with the strength of the beer, the alcohol content. It's the grain and how it was roasted. So anyway, back to this packet. You get the grain here, and now what you really need to do is think of this as soup. These are the ingredients in soup. So you're going to take this grain and you're going to put it in a bag. I use a nylon bag, and you're going to steep it in hot water. And you're going to steep it in the hot water until you've taken all the sugar out of the grain. So the water will literally become like a weak tea. So that being said, that's how you do what's called all grain brewing, meaning you start from the grain. Well, there's people that say, I want to enjoy this process, and I don't want to go all the way to the beginning with the grain. I want to start a little bit easier. I want a shortcut. So this is for people who want to do that. This is called liquid malt extract. So what they've done in the factory is they've taken that grain, they've made that tea, they've gotten all the sugar out of it, and what they did was then they concentrated it. So it's like a syrup. Think of this, I mean, this is like molasses.
So they
very
sort of
sweet.
pre-process the grain, if you
Yes.
will, so you can go skip that one step.
Exactly. So there's a big group of people that say the only beer that's worth brewing is all grain brewing. You start with the grain and you do it yourself. And then there's other people who say, I don't have 3 or 4 extra hours to brew, and I want that work already done. So that's a big group. So this is called extract, and that's called all grain. You can combine them. So this pumpkin ale, a good example, is going to begin with steeping the grain in the water, pulling the sugar out of the grain, and then I'm going to melt this in with the water and dissolve it into the water.
Is that just going to shortcut the process of
Yes.
that, rather than going through the full grain process?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about the grain part. What other ingredients need to go into?
Good. Another good question. There's only 4 ingredients in beer. 4 ingredients, and you can add other ingredients. But minimally, there's 4. So there's obviously water. There's malted barley or malted grain of some kind. It can be, a good example is Budweiser. The light beers, so-called light beers, use malted rice because rice adds the sugar, but it doesn't add flavor. A hallmark of an American beer is it doesn't have much flavor. So that's what they do. They get the sugar, which is obviously turns into alcohol, some of it, and it gives it that beer flavor without the too much flavor. So let's go back here. We've got malted barley, we've got water. The other ingredient you're going to have is you're going to have hops. And I'm going to hold up some hops here. This is a flour. Hop flour is a very interesting flour because what you have to do is you dry it out, and the flour has a very pungent odor. It's a very spicy odor. Different varieties of hops have different flavors, and they have a different effect on the beer. Way back before they knew about bacteria, all they knew about was that if they put malted barley in water and if they left it out overnight, something would happen. It would begin to ferment and it would produce alcohol. And it would make the water safe to drink, because back then water wasn't safe. The only way to make water safe was to make beer out of it. And so beer really served a very important purpose. But what they found out was if they add hops to it, it keeps the bacteria from growing in it. Because remember that sugar in the water, the yeast want to eat that, but so do bacteria. You don't want bacteria in your beer. That would cause problems. So you put hops in. Hops don't kill bacteria, they prevent bacteria from growing. So hops are a very important flour. They're very, very interesting because each variety of hops has different flavors and different odor, different smells. The other way that you can buy hops is you buy them in pellets. And these pellets are the hop flour ground down and concentrated into little pellets that I'm dropping all over, so I'm not going to drop any more pellets.
All right.
I'll pick those up. Anyway, the last ingredient that goes in is yeast. This is the ingredient that more than any other ingredient, is responsible for the flavor of the beer. Every yeast variety has a different characteristic about it. And so if you're going to do a German wheat beer, you use a German wheat beer yeast. If you're going to do a stout, use a yeast that's good for stout. There isn't one all-purpose yeast that you would use for everything. So when you go to make a batch of beer and you want to make a specific style of beer, you need to research it a little bit and figure out what kind of yeast you need. And so those are the 4 ingredients: the water, the malted barley or malted grain of some kind, hops, and yeast. So the most important thing you need when you're going to brew a batch of beer is a recipe. And the recipe, you can get these off the internet. You can go into the local brew store and you can say, this is the kind of beer I'm looking to brew. I want to make something like a Sam Adams cherry wheat. And they'll say, you take this recipe, and because it's a wheat beer, you'll modify it a little bit. You put a can of cherry puree in it, and you'll buy a small bottle of cherry extract and put that in the fermenter when you're all done. And that'll give you pretty close to a Sam Adams cherry wheat. So the recipe, you'll follow it. It's very simple. Anybody can follow a brewing recipe, truly. It's much easier than cooking. The biggest question I had from my wife when I got started was, I said, it says you need to boil. What does that mean? What kind of boil? And she laughed at me and said, well, you haven't cooked very much, have you? So the boil is just a standard boil, not a rigorous boil, but just a nice, slow rolling boil. That's all you need to do. And that's really it as far as what you need to make a batch of beer.
So we've got our ingredients.
Yep.
We've got our recipe. Now, what equipment do we need?
Okay.
And I see you brought an assortment of equipment here.
Yeah.
So take us through what all this is and how we can put it all together.
Okay.
It looks almost like a still, but it's not a still.
No, not a still, because we're fermenting, not distilling.
Okay.
The benefit that I have to pass along to new people getting started in brewing is that I learned a few things, and I learned them the hard way. You don't want to brew on the kitchen stove. The one reason right away is that you can't bring 6 gallons or 5 gallons of water up to boil on a standard stove. It's impossible. So the way around this is a lot of people do what's called a partial boil. So what they'll do is they'll put 2 gallons of water in the kettle, they'll boil that, they'll put all their ingredients in, and when they're done, they'll then add cold water to bring it to the temperature where you can pitch the yeast, because you don't want to add yeast to hot water, it'll kill the yeast. That to me would be like making soup. By putting the ingredients and making the soup, and then before company comes over, you add a lot of water so you have more soup. It's just not going to give you the kind of flavor that you really want. It's not going to let those flavors mingle together, and the process, the chemical process that goes on in brewing is very important. You want to boil the liquid because you're breaking everything down so the yeast can eat it. So if you're not doing a full boil, the yeast are going to have a hard time eating all these different chemicals in the water and breaking them down.
So what do you do in the boil end if you're not going to use the kitchen stove?
Yep.
So you have it looks like a huge pot here.
This is a 10-gallon stainless steel kettle. The rule about brewing is you can use anything you want as long as it's not aluminum. The problem with aluminum is, and some people argue this, there's again another faction that say, oh, you can use aluminum. Aluminum tends to be affected by acidic pH. So this liquid you're going to put in here, which is, before it's fermented, is called wort, W-O-R-T, the wort. So all these ingredients get added, they're boiled, it's called wort. It's pretty acidic, and it can actually pull some of the aluminum off the inside of the kettle. So it's a stainless steel kettle, and there's nothing really fancy about it at all. You don't need to have openings on the front. I have basically 2 openings. One is for a thermometer, and the other one is for a spigot, so that I can open it up when I'm done and actually put the liquid from the brewing vessel into the fermenter. And I'll show you that part in a moment. I like this because this gets heavy. When you have 5 to 6 gallons of liquid in there, it's pretty heavy. So now the other part, after
So before you leave that, what are you boiling this with?
Oh,
Not-
I'm
it's
very
not on the
sorry.
stove.
I didn't bring the cooker with me. I have what's called a king cooker. Some people would call it a turkey fryer. It hooks to either a propane tank outside or natural gas. Mine hooks to natural gas. And really what you do is you put the kettle on there, you do it outside. And the reason you do it outside is twofold. One is you have the BTUs needed to bring that water to boil. And if you have a boil over, which I guarantee you will, you're not going to mess anything up. I had a boil over on the kitchen stove when I first started brewing, and I had to buy an entire new top to the kitchen stove because it burned on. It was like burnt molasses on the stove. So you don't want to do that. If you want your wife or your significant other to support you in this hobby, you don't want to be messing up the kitchen. So I would strongly recommend a kettle. When I got into this hobby, kettles were very expensive. My friend just bought a kettle for $80 at the home brewing store with the holes already welded into it and everything. So that's kind of nice.
So we got our kettle, we got our burner.
Yep.
What else do we have here?
The other thing you have when you're done boiling the liquid and you want to cool it down, basically you have a an immersion wort cooler. And all this is copper coil. That's all it is. And you set it down into the hot liquid. At this point, the liquid's still boiling. And you hook one end to the garden hose, cold water, and the other end out to the grass. Or in the summertime, I put that into the swimming pool because it's hot water when it comes out. And I run cold water through here. And to give you an idea, I can bring this down from 210 degrees Fahrenheit to 75 degrees in a half hour. That's important because when you're done brewing, you want to cool it down quickly before you pitch the yeast.
Okay.
Brings up one other point, and some people make a bigger issue of this than necessary. But before you brew everything, you can put in objects that are not sanitary, meaning you can take honey that has other things in it, waxes and things like that. And you can put them in here, and when you boil it, you're literally sanitizing everything. You're killing off wild bacteria, wild yeast. Once you cool this material down, you must protect it because bacteria can get in there. So the hops help you a little bit, but the other thing is good sanitary technique. So everything that touches, anything that touches the beer has to be cleaned and sanitized. And they make special sanitizer. They used to have you use bleach. And the problem with bleach is it's very corrosive to stainless steel. You don't want to use it for stainless steel. And for plastic, it tends to corrode and damage plastic. So now they have different types of cleaners. They're really nice. You clean your gear, you rinse it, and you're ready to go. So after the batch has been boiled and it's been brewed, and the recipe will tell you how long to do that. They'll tell you what temperature you need to bring it down to. You put your chiller in, you look at the thermometer. Once you get it brought down to the right temperature, you then move it into the fermenter. And if you can grab that fermenter.
This is the fermenter?
Yeah, and this is not a normal one. This is the one that my mother got me, the Mr. Beer kit. And it goes up to 6 gallons, which is really nice. The important thing about this, and now we use pails, plastic pails with a lid on them. They also have what's called a glass carboy, which looks like the big giant jug that people save quarters in with the small opening. The problem with those is it's hard to clean them, especially the glass carboy. This is easy to clean. I can unscrew this lid and get my hand in there and just wipe it out when I'm done brewing. You don't want to use anything abrasive on this. You don't want to scratch it because then it'll give bacteria a place to grow. It has a spigot in the bottom. So I take this lid off, and you'll notice it has a hole in the top. The hole in the top is for an airlock to let CO2 out. As the yeast are working and they're fermenting, they're producing CO2. You need to let that gas out of the solution. And that little hole, I didn't bring an airlock with me, but it's just a one-way valve that lets the gas out. So you go from the boiling vessel, the kettle, into the fermenter, and this is where the action takes place. This is where you pitch your yeast. You pour your yeast right in on top. You put the lid on this, and you put it in your basement for a week to 10 days.
Okay.
While the other reason I like this plastic is that you can actually see it happening. You can see the yeast working, and you'll see a circulatory pattern in the liquid moving, so you know the yeast are busy. And you start off with 100 billion yeast in this little tube. There are 100 billion yeast, so they're working, and they multiply quickly, and they eat, and they're eating the sugars and converting them to alcohol and carbon dioxide. And you can put your nose here, and you can smell the smells that after a while become familiar to you as a brewer, and you say, oh, okay, I can smell the hops, I can smell the malt, I can smell everything. It's doing just what it should be doing. It's fermenting, it's turning into beer. So this is where it really happens, right here in the fermenter.
So we've got we're after the fermenter now. Yep. What do we need? Okay,
and you notice that there's a spigot at the bottom of that fermenter, which is really important because what you do is you hook a hose to that, you open the spigot, you take the airlock off the top, and you've already sanitized and people refer to these as a keg, a Cornelius keg. This is from It actually was a ready-mix pop dispenser when Coca-Cola used to distribute pop in
I was
steel
about to
kegs.
say, this looks like something that a soft drink fountain would be hooked up to.
Exactly. The way they used to distribute their products was they would distribute it in a ready-mix container. This had everything you needed but the carbon dioxide. So the brewing people have kind of taken this over because Coca-Cola and all the major pop distributors switched to a system called bag in a box, which is like a box wine. It's got a plastic bag in the middle with a box around it, and they distribute it like that. It's less expensive than these canisters. The interesting thing about these were made by Firestone, by Kelsey Hayes, by Hoover. So you think, why would Hoover make them? Vacuum cleaner company, and so it makes sense. So these, a few years ago, were free. Now they're worth about $100, and brewers love them. And they're just good for a multitude of reasons, which you'll see in just a moment. Because all you're going to do with this, it's stainless steel, you're going to clean it, you're going to sanitize it, and you put your beer in here, and there's two posts. One post is for the liquid out, and one post is for gas in. So you have a small CO2 tank.
Okay, that's what this is here.
Yeah, this is carbon dioxide, not flammable, not dangerous, but it's about $60 for the tank and about $40 or $50 for the regulator. You don't need one of these for each keg. You could have 5 kegs, each with a different liquid in it, and you could run them all off of that one tank and that one regulator. But you're simply going to hook up the gas to one side and the liquid outlet to the other, and you put a lid on here and you seal it. And you can leave the beer, you can put it right from there into a refrigerator. You can keep it nice and cold. Or they make a thing called a jockey box, which is a plastic igloo cooler with beer in the back. It's got 100 feet of stainless steel coil. You put ice in there, and you got a tap handle on the front. So the warm beer comes in, goes through the coil, gets nice and cold. This way here is very easy because you take this out of your refrigerator, and usually it's a refrigerator in the garage with all the shelves out of it. People ask me about kegerators. Should I buy a kegerator? A kegerator is a special refrigerator for a keg. They're very expensive, and they're limited in their size. So if you try to put one of these corny kegs in, and it's a little too tall, you're going to be in trouble. So if you buy a $400 refrigerator at ABC Appliance, the least expensive refrigerator you can find, you can fit 2 of these and the CO2 tank in at the same time. And usually people use an older refrigerator. They even go to the extent of putting a hole in the door and putting a tap handle through the door so they can dispense the beer right from the door of the refrigerator. That's what
Refrigerator on tap.
Exactly. So the beer, basically that's it. From the brewing process in the kettle to the fermenter to the keg. And people always ask me, how long does it last in the keg?
Right.
Beer is spoiled by 3 things. Spoiled by exposure to air, by exposure to heat, and by exposure to light. So a good example is if you take your beer glass outside in the summertime and set it on the edge of the pool, in about 10 minutes it's ruined from the sun beating on it. It gives it kind of a skunky flavor. And so when you put beer in a stainless steel container, you're protecting it from exposure to light, obviously, air, because you've got CO2 in there pressurizing it. And you keep it, as long as you don't put it in the attic in 110 degree weather, it's going to be good for a long time. Right now I'm serving a cherry wheat at the house in the garage that has been in there a year. It's been in the keg a year.
Okay. Well, you talked about all the equipment. Now, how much does all this cost? You said before that you could actually save money.
Yep.
But you got quite a bit of equipment here.
Exactly. To buy every single thing that you would need here that I've shown, plus the cooker that I didn't bring with me, would be approximately $600.
Okay.
Every one of those items is reusable. For instance, this kettle can be used at Thanksgiving to fry a turkey. It can be used to make soup. You can use it for whatever you want. It's not dedicated to brewing. The CO2 tank is obviously single purpose, use it for brewing. The fermenter, you can use a pail, a big 6-gallon pail they actually make for fermenting. One of the things you can do with the kegs, and I'm doing this for the 4th of July party next year, we're already planning, is I'm going to make root beer, ginger ale, and sarsaparilla pop and put each one in a keg. So the kids will have their pop on tap. So what I'm saying is that $600 gets you started, gets you everything you need that you see right here, and some of these items can be used for other things also. Now to brew a batch of beer, as I showed you earlier, this kit, the pumpkin ale was a special at the beer store, $25.
Okay.
So this $25 kit is everything you need to make 5 gallons of beer.
Plus, you would need the yeast as well, right?
The yeast comes with it for $25.
Oh, the yeast comes with it.
Yeah,
it. Okay.
yeah. So you get everything you need: the hops, the malted barley, the liquid malted barley, and the yeast for $25.
Really?
Some beers cost more than that. The cherry wheat, you start with this, but then you add cherry extract, which is $10 for a bottle, and the cherry puree, which is about $16 a bottle, or a can. It's a large can of cherry puree.
So how many gallons of beer will that make? How much beer will you get out of that?
You can get anywhere between 5 and 6 gallons.
Okay.
So it's really a function of how big your kettle is, how big your fermenter is, and how much you can put in the keg. The kegs are called 5-gallon kegs. You can fit a little more than 5 gallons, probably 5.5 gallons.
Is that a typical brew amount?
Just over 5 gallons. Yeah,
Okay.
That's the standard amount. The one item I didn't talk about, and I just wanted to bring this up really quickly because this is something that people usually have questions about. They'll say, how do I know how much alcohol is in the beer? Very simple. When you're done taking the beer out of the kettle and putting it in the fermenter, there's always some left in the bottom. You take a little bit, you put it in this tube, and you take this paper out. You don't need the paper in here. And then what you do is you have a weighted thermometer, and it looks like a thermometer. It's actually called a hydrometer. And you set this in here, and it will float. And there's a line that you read, and you'll get the weight of the water plus dissolved sugars. So the weight of water is 1. So anything over 1 is the weight of the sugars in the water. So then what you do when you're done fermenting and you're putting it into the keg, you take another little sample out with a sanitary syringe or a turkey baster that's been cleaned and sanitized. You take a little sample out, you weigh it again. You put the difference between those two, the beginning gravity, how much it weighed, the finishing gravity, and there are many, many websites that have formulas and they'll tell you exactly what the alcohol content is. And so you can play with the alcohol content. You can put more sugar in and make it stronger. You can put less sugar in. By sugar, I mean anything that contains sugar. So the malt, the honey,
yes.
whatever you choose, right? So you can control the amount of alcohol. So if you said, well, I really like this cherry wheat beer, but it's just got a little too much alcohol, can we knock that down? You can. So that's the flexibility you get with brewing on your own. You can make it any way you want.
So where do you get all this equipment and the information and the ingredients? Where can people find that?
Almost every major metropolitan area has a home brewing store. Right
Really?
here.
There are home brewing stores?
Yes, absolutely. The one that I tend to like the most around here is in Taylor, Michigan, and it's called Adventures in Home Brewing. They also have a store in Ann Arbor. I'm not affiliated with the store. I'm just a very satisfied customer. There are some other stores. The internet is probably the most popular place, especially for getting recipes. You never have to pay for a recipe. They're out there. There's so many brewing websites and forums. It's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. This is a very popular hobby, and it's gotten even more popular. Probably 20 years ago, it was popular for a different reason. It was really hard to find a good beer. You'd go to the store and they had your typical beers, American-style lagers, pilsners. If you wanted something different than that, you were going to have to go to a special store, pay a lot of money for it, and it was usually stale. The bottle, when you go in and the bottles are all dusty on the shelves, it's a good indication they're not moving the beer. It's not fresh. And so people said, well, I'm not satisfied with that. I want to brew my own. And that's what really got home brewing going. Now it's just a nice hobby. It isn't a lot of money. It's a very affordable hobby. It's a very social hobby. So most of the people that brew meet with other people that brew. I brewed last week with 3 other guys. It's a lot of fun. One guy served venison chili. Usually drink the beer that you brewed the last batch at the batch that you're brewing now. But it's a very social hobby, much more social than some other hobbies.
So what's the best way for people to get started? I'm assuming, sounds like you had a little bit of trial and error, but do they have brewing clubs, or do you just, if you find a friend who, like yourself, who has experience, how do people normally get started?
They normally get started by talking to somebody who brews and coming over to their house and saying, can I help? That's the really good way to learn. You can also join a brewer's guild. There are groups of people that like to brew, and typically people who like to brew like to talk about brewing and like to teach other people how to do it. Ford Motor Company has a Brewers Guild. most large companies do. In IT, it's very popular, very, very popular, it seems. And I think the best way is to have somebody walk you through the process because it's like cooking. And if you're cooking and you watch it on TV, why is it popular to watch cooking shows? Because it's easier to understand the process, right, if you're seeing it being done. So I think it's the same thing with brewing. My friends that I taught how to brew last week said, now, is this normal? Is this what I should see? Is this what should happen? And when I told them, yeah, everything is fine, it calmed them down. I think they would have been a little bit more nervous if they wouldn't have had me there telling them, yeah, this is normal. That's what should happen. And when we measured the finishing gravity on the one beer, and it was absolutely perfect, you could just see them getting pretty happy about it, saying, wow, I'm looking forward to this. So it's a good hobby. One of the best hobbies I can think of. It's good year-round. Typically, brewing season is spring, summer, fall. Most people don't brew in the winter. Part of the reason for that originally was while the beer is fermenting, while the wort is fermenting and turning into beer, it needs to be kept at probably 70 to 75 degrees. But they make little heaters that wrap around the fermenter. You can put a heating pad under it. I found a basement is a really good place to brew and or bring your fermenter in after you're done brewing. I brew outside. When you go with a natural gas brewer or a propane brewer, obviously you don't want to be doing that in the house. So the one piece of advice I always offer to people, though, is get a big enough kettle and do not brew on the kitchen stove.
Okay.
That's the one word of wisdom I could leave people with, because that will never end well.
Okay. Well, that's about as much time as we have for Exploring Hobbies. We'd like to thank Arta Dagny for talking to us all about home brewing. Stay tuned for another episode upcoming of Exploring Hobbies.